Hello and welcome to Economics and You. I'm your host, Mr. Samuelson. Today, we're going to be correcting for inflation, that pesky little bugger that leads to rising prices. Well, first, what is inflation? Well, inflation must be accounted for every time we look at GDP, so it's important for us to understand what that is here as we learn about macroeconomics and the gross domestic product. What inflation is it's the rise in the price of goods and services. That is the idea that things cost more now than they used to. For example, in 1972, you might be able to buy a cartload of groceries for about 20 bucks. By 1992, you could buy just a few items for 20 bucks. And now when you go to the store, you might be lucky just to get two or three things for 20 bucks because prices have risen. Inflation exists. As inflation exists, the dollar can purchase less than what it used to be able to purchase. That's the idea. Now, how does that impact GDP? Well, rising inflation causes GDP to rise, right? GDP is just a dollar measurement of the value of goods and services in the American economy. And as the price of the things that we buy increases, its dollar value increases, so our GDP increases. But the problem with this is that we'll see this rising GDP number and possibly misinterpret it and read it to say that we are producing that many more goods and services, when that's not actually the case. It's just the cost of those goods and services has gone up. So we need to worry about inflation. We also need to worry about deflation, but not as much. Deflation is this prolonged drop in prices. So inflation is the increase in prices. Deflation is the decrease in prices. Now, in modern times, this doesn't happen. In the United States, it doesn't happen very much at all. But it does happen around the world a little bit. And it's a serious problem because in a deflationary cycle, people resist spending money. They don't want to spend money because the opposite is true, right? Your money is worth more tomorrow than it is today. It might be worth even more a month from now than it is today, or a year from now. So let's hold on to that money and not spend it. But that has a problem. The problem here is that once you start saving, you're going to spend less money on goods and services. Okay? That means we wind up with an oversupply of goods and services. Producers are going to produce less because people aren't buying it. Once producers produce less, we get lower prices for goods and services because they've got to get rid of it. They've got to get it off the shelves. So they do decrease those prices. This is a smaller cash flow and profits for companies. So with lower prices, they're making less profits, which means now that they're not producing as much and now that they're not profiting as much, they're not going to supply as much, so they don't need to hire as many people. So firings happen, layoffs happen, and then we get unemployment. As unemployment increases, of course, we wind up with less spending on goods, which means we have even more stuff that we can't sell, which means we lower prices even further, companies profit even less, we've got to fire even more people, and we get into this really bad downward cycle. Deflation is a bad, horrible thing. Let's get back to inflation, though, because that's primarily what we deal with here in the United States. Here in the United States, the most important measure of inflation is the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. This measures the base price of a large number of goods and services. And we're talking about tens of thousands of goods and services that are piled in to this CPI calculation. Now, these prices produce what is called in economics a market basket, a collection of all the different things in the economy that are representative of who we are and what we purchase. And we use this to measure our CPI, our Consumer Price Index. That is, how much of our money are we spending? And every 10 years or so, we've got to update this because we've got iPhones now. Just as a basic look at what we're looking at here, we've got housing, okay, what you might pay on your housing. This is other housing upkeep and maintenance and et cetera, clothing, transportation, et cetera, all the way around the cycle. These are the types of things that are measured within our CPI measurements, okay? So we find out what are the costs of all of these goods. right? We figure that out in a given year. And then we can figure that out in other years as well to see how much those prices have increased. Remember, increases in prices are inflation. So we use this data and all these monthly CPI numbers, they take them monthly. All these monthly CPI numbers are compared to a base year. So you take one base year and you're going to compare everything back to that. The comparison will show the rise in consumer prices, also known as inflation, rise in consumer prices and inflation. Make sure we know that. So as those consumer prices rise, the CPI is rising, inflation is rising because inflation is just the comparison of current CPI to our base year's CPI. Now, knowing the inflation rate helps us understand real GDP growth. Without knowing inflation, we don't know how much our economy is really actually growing. Now, another number that is used, which is important for predicting economic trends, is the producer price index, or the PPI. This PPI is a measurement of how much a producer charges for their goods. Now, it's important for us to know that producers aren't all dealing with consumers directly, right? Producers produce on many levels and provide goods to many people long before it gets to us, the consumer. These include raw materials. Okay, so it's going to be the actual farm products that are food. Okay, the cow, not the hamburger. It's going to include capital investment, how much they're purchasing tractors to harvest food or machinery to make your clothing. All those things are rolled into the PPI. And if you pay attention to the PPI and you see a rise in the producer price index, that is the mine that digs up and produces copper, is increasing the prices of copper, selling it down the line, well, eventually that's going to hit the CPI, the consumer price index. And eventually that will lead to inflation. But if you're really watching this number, you can have an early predictor as to when inflation will happen. Economists will pay attention to this when they're warning of potential inflation. It's because they're seeing a rise in the producer price index. Now, for the purposes of our class and for understanding GDP, I want to come back to this. We have to understand how much growth is real growth versus how much growth is inflation. So the government intentionally deflates the GDP. They deflate it by subtracting inflation from the number. So if we use the consumer price index from 2010 and now look at 2016 prices, and we see that in the CPI of those 2 years, the price of goods has risen 4.5%, then we can say we've had 4.5% inflation over that time. So we need to reduce our GDP number, our nominal GDP, that's just what it is in today's prices. We need to reduce that by 4.5% to get what is called our real GDP, our gross domestic product minus inflation. When we do this, we can compare 2016 to 2010. We can compare 1880 to 1980. We can look at big trends in the economy and understand national growth and growth trends much better because inflation is factored out. That is all for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson and that you learned something. Farewell.